Does anybody in the room know what one of the best predictors of a child's socioeconomic outcome is? One of the best predictors of a child's socioeconomic outcome is their grade 3 reading level. That's right, their grade 3 reading level. My wife, Connie, is a reading recovery teacher, and she spends her days working with children that need a little bit of extra help to get ready for those grade 3 reading tests. When she told me this statistic, I was a little bit skeptical. Now, being the kind of guy that might need proof for certain things, I went and actually read the studies. And what the studies told us was that it wasn't merely the ability to read and identify words that mattered. It was the children's abilities to comprehend and implement what they had learned. And when I thought of that, it started to make a little bit of sense, because at grade 3, we start to get those foundational levels where we'll use those for science and math and history and other subjects. So if the child is unable to comprehend and apply what they've learned, they end up having some difficulties as they get a little older. What happens is, as they get through high school, the rate of dropouts actually is exponential. And for those that are successful in completing high school, what happens is some of their post-secondary choices may be different. Connie and I have been married for 26 years. And as our lives evolved, she went down the path of education. I went down a path of financial services. It's really quite interesting to me, though, that when we look at issues around literacy, be it in children, or financial literacy, it really boiled down to issues around education and empowerment. When we talk about financial literacy, the basic definition is, how do we deal with money and how do we interact with money? Now, if we hearken back to that example of a grade 3 reading level, the question is that really enough? So when we talk about financial literacy, and we've been doing this now for almost 25 years, working with families that have family businesses, what we find is that the basic definitions around financial literacy are often not adequate. When we talk about financial literacy, we want to talk about things such as financial knowledge, adding to that financial knowledge and coming out with what we would like to call financial wisdom, and then being able to combine these two for increased impact. Today, we're going to spend a little bit of time in this talk and understand what financial knowledge and financial wisdom means. We're going to talk about setting yourself up for success, things around competence and confidence, financial values, and bringing it all together. Now, as we come in this room today, we understand that the target audience is geared for the next generation. I suspect there's a couple of people in this room that may also be from previous generations. As we talk about financial literacy, I have a challenge for each of you. For those of you in the first generations, please take the challenge to teach. For those of you in the second and subsequent generations, please take the challenge to learn. I'm going to talk about that a little bit more, but please hear me as I frame that. Does anybody know what this is? I'll give you a hint. It has nothing to do with financial services. This is a Plisoll line. And what a Plisoll line is, it's in response to a lot of bad behavior in the 1800s in shipping. There was an emergence of something that was referred to as coffin ships. What would happen is that through the time of colonization, the merchants would be incented to overload their ships. As they went to the New World to find these treasures, they were incented to overload their ships and to send them home. Now, the challenge, of course, is with these overloaded ships, some of them didn't make it home. They actually sank. But for those that made it home, there was tremendous profits to be had by these merchant shippers. For the ships they lost, they actually were able to take out an insurance policy. And the insurers, well, they charged such exorbitant premiums that for the ships that were lost, they were satisfied to pay that profit arrangement. For the ships that made it home, of course, the insurers didn't have to pay out a benefit. And that premium, which was exorbitant, became their profit. So when we talk about the issues around what I will call the shipping value chain, there was one part of this shipping value chain that didn't have a backstop. Remember, they called them coffin ships. The group of the value chain that didn't have the backstop were the sailors. So in 1875, a gentleman by the name of Samuel Plisoll worked to pass a legislation to have this Plisoll Line put on the side of every cargo ship. And what was the intent of the Plisoll Line? The Plisoll Line was intended so that as a sailor approached the ship, they had some indication of what their potential outcome could be. Now let's be really clear. That is not a guarantee of success. But what it is, it's a pretty good indicator of probability of failure. When we talk about financial literacy is exactly that. It is not a guarantee of success. It is, however, something that can help you improve your probability of not failing. The question becomes, what is your Plisoll line? What is your business's Plisoll line? What are your family's Plisoll lines? Is there one line, or are there multiple lines? Again, as I alluded to, when it comes to financial literacy, for Generation 2, the challenge is to learn. For Generation 1, is to facilitate the teaching. When we talk about financial literacy, you heard me talk about financial knowledge. And financial knowledge is simply that. Financial knowledge becomes the textbook learnings, the basic things. When I was a young guy, I grew up in a family with a family business. And for me, financial literacy happened every single day. But it was quite interesting upon reflection because it was more around balancing checkbooks, making change, understanding personal budgets and constraints. When I think today, I don't even know if that's happening with children anymore. Balancing checkbooks? In the days where we have all these tap debits and e-transfers, and heck, there's not even pennies anymore. What's happening around financial literacy today? Well, of interest, we would like to think that more complex things are being spoken of. Maybe budgets and financial statements and things like that. We're not necessarily seeing that transcending. There are some groups, and there may be some groups in this room, that are actually taking other challenges and they're looking to see and learn about optimal capital structures. Learn about advanced corporate financial statements. There are some that we have encountered that have actually taken it another step further around financial knowledge and gone out and learned about the financial markets, learned about other financial instruments, doing specialized training in economics. That's great, and that's exactly what it is learning. When we talk about financial knowledge, many people will tell you that knowledge is power. I'm here to tell you that knowledge is actually the beginning. From knowledge, what we hope to see happen is that there's going to be some other experiences that will come in. There will be some other people that will model some choices and hope for you to start to begin to understand some financial wisdom. When we combine the financial knowledge with the financial wisdom, what we have seen over the 25 years of doing this type of work is that's when we start to see exceptional results and impact. If we talk about financial knowledge, I want to tell you that financial knowledge really looks like this. It's learning. It's paper-based. When we talk about financial wisdom, I would like to suggest to you that financial wisdom looks like this. A Rubik's Cube. What do we know about Rubik's Cubes? They're complex, they take time to master, and they have multiple sides in depth. When we talk about multiple sides in depth and gaining wisdom, the challenge is it is very uncomfortable. Because in order to be prepared to gain wisdom, you need to be prepared to be a little bit vulnerable. You need to be prepared to ask for others' input and advice. Recognizing that the challenge that many of us have is sometimes we don't want to be vulnerable, and sometimes we're in circumstances where being vulnerable isn't necessarily rewarded. Well, the challenge often is that our reaction to that is to tend to overconfidence. The challenge is many of us are experts in certain areas. And what we have learned over time is a communication pattern that says, if I can exert confidence and perceived expertise in one area, quite often that's transferable to another. What we have learned is that there's a very fine line between underconfidence and overconfidence. We will come back to this in a moment because when we look at this very fine line, the challenge is, what is the risk of making an error and the expense of that error based on a perceived overconfidence? We can talk about financial knowledge, we can talk about financial wisdom leading to these exceptional outcomes. What I can tell you, however, is there is one element of this that isn't spoken of, that needs to be spoken of, and that is financial values. Now, when I talk about financial values, I'm not talking about normal values that we may all share around integrity and trust and work ethic. What I'm talking about are values around such things such as spend versus save. Things such as charity, philanthropy, buy now, pay later. These are values that are taught to us and passed down to us. Often what happens, financial values are formed as a part of your family. So there's an experience, and an experience that some of you may have had happen to you, where you grow up in a family and we hear about values being passed down within the families. And then what happens is some 28 years later, you meet the love of your life, and you get married and you form a new family. The person that you've married has come from their own family, and they have their own values. Often, those values may not be completely aligned. And what happens is that you take this new set of values and you apply it in an environment that has their own set. And sometimes what we start to see are conflicts. So when we talk about the importance of financial literacy, and we talk about being vulnerable enough to talk about values, basically what it will do, and specifically in a family business, is break down some of those old communication patterns. This is the slide that I referred to earlier. The challenge often, and what I would call the 3 a.m. staring at the ceiling thoughts, are as we come into these new challenges and we're starting to develop and build new competencies, some of us may rely on an overconfidence. The challenge is, sometimes when Generation 1 sees this, this is exactly what they're most afraid of. So by having open conversations around the creation of wisdom, open conversations around values, it helps us bridge the gap between feelings that you may have and feelings that other in the family system may have. Having done this for 25 years, the one thing that I can tell you is that often the last names are different. The businesses may be different, but the things that you're dealing with are often very similar. So when it comes to points of conflict, I'm putting forward 3 very simple scenarios for us just to consider and reflect upon. These are 3 that we see quite often. One is around the optimal use of capital. I colloquially frame it, till debt do us part. And these are within your family and within your businesses. What are your values around growth? What are your values around the use of debt? What are your values around the use of personal assets for business growth? What are your values around the use of business assets for personal consumption and satisfaction? Some challenging questions in this section. Or another one around investing in your business versus investing in your business. With many businesses that we deal with, often there's excess cash inside of the business. What are the values around what you do with that cash? Often it comes from the experiences of the previous generations. Is it important for your family and for your business to have a very large war chest? To have a safety valve in case something goes sideways? Or are the values around taking those excess resources and putting them back into the business? More of what we would call an inventory model. Or is it that you pay them out to other members of the ownership group? Or are you using those for outside investments, outside of the business? Investments maybe in capital markets or real estate. A lot of these types of decisions are driven very much by the financial values. One of my favorite, lifestyle now versus lifestyle later. If ever there is a conversation that potentially can cause conflict in a system, it's this. We have heard the tagline that says, "You're richer than you think." When you're running a family business, we find sometimes that you look at the balance sheet and then you look at your personal bank account. Sometimes you're poorer than you feel. What are the values around this? So what do these 3 scenarios have in common? Point 1 is that there's no right or wrong answer. Number 2 is that determining your right answer requires financial knowledge and wisdom that are shaped by your values. You need to own your financial values. Recognize they may not be the same. But as we look to have an increased impact of this work, by owning your financial values, you then can own the outcomes. Most importantly, Generation 1 and Generation 2, subsequent generations, may not necessarily agree. So, financial values leading to financial wisdom, leading to financial impact. Many of you may be sitting in the room today and saying, "Great, got this, we're in great shape." Others may be saying, there's some interesting things here that I'd like to explore. Let me ask you for one challenge, and that is to be that little bit vulnerable, that if there are things that you would like to explore, to find somebody to talk to those things about. If you find yourself in the case where you're sitting here and all of this is pretty easy, I challenge you to find somebody to share that with. It can be within your system. It can be outside of your system. What I'm here to tell you is that this continuum with the overlay of values is not as common sense as many of us may feel. 3 takeaways. The Plisoll Line is intended to protect you. Understand what your Plisoll Line is and put an action plan together to get there. Don't be afraid to seek advice And don't be afraid to give advice. It's through that dynamic interaction that financial wisdom is created. And please, please hear me when I say to you, financial knowledge may not be enough. Thank you.